You're listening to Retail Disrupted, a podcast that explores the latest industry developments and the trends that will shape how we shop in the future. I'm your host, Natalie Berg. Hello, and welcome back to Retail Disrupted. I know it's been a little while since the last episode, and as many of you know, that was always the plan. I always take August off to be with the kids and have a little break from the podcast, have a little break from retail, or at least talking retail, and then pick up again in September. So it's great to be back. That last episode, by the way, which was about the need for Amazon to disrupt itself in order to stay relevant in the future. That last episode with Maya Knights has been really, really popular. So I'm really glad that the content is resonating, that you're getting value from it. And I'm going to make a little bit more of an effort to get other analysts on the podcast, which is how the podcast started out. I started out kind of reaching out to my many friends and former colleagues in the industry to bring you original insight and opinion. So we're gonna do more of that, but I'm also gonna be balancing that with my interviews with retail leaders. So the podcast is booked out for most of the rest of the year. I do have a few slots available in early December, and if you are a retailer or a brand or an analyst and you'd like to join me on the show, please get in touch. You can reach me directly on hello@nbkretail.com. And let's have a conversation. Today's guest is the founder of two well-known global brands, GameStop and Laura Mercier Cosmetics. I'm thrilled to have Gary Kusin joining me on the show today to talk about everything from malls to meme stocks. Now, let me tell you a little bit more about Gary. He is a mentor, investor, entrepreneur, business advisor, podcast host, and author of the book, Always Learning, Lessons on Leveling Up from GameStop to Laura Mercier and Beyond. Today, Gary advises an array of public and private companies on strategy, management, and growth issues. In addition, Gary continues his full schedule of mentoring and has mentored well over 1,000 individuals during the course of his career. Gary spent 13 years as a senior advisor to the global private equity firm TPG, and he also served as president and CEO of Kinko's, which, of course, today is operating as FedEx Office. Gary was responsible for the turnaround, strategic growth, and transformation of Kinko's, and he oversaw the sale of the business to FedEx back in the early 2000s. Gary has been named Entrepreneur of the Year by Inc. magazine. He has served on the board of a number of retail businesses, both in the U.S. and internationally, including Electronic Arts, Petco, Sabre, and Myer Department Stores in Australia. Gary, it's such a privilege to have you on the show. Welcome to Retail Disrupted.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me.
Gary, I'd like to start out talking about GameStop. You started out in retail at a very young age, working in the warehouse of your family furniture store. You then went on to work at Macy's after graduating college, and then became the co-founder of two well-known global brands, GameStop, which of course was called Babbage's at the time, and the cosmetics brand Laura Mercier. We're also going to talk about your time at Kinko's, but just to get us started, I wonder if we can go back to the early 80s. Can you remind us what retail was like then and what inspired you to launch GameStop?
Sure. That is a very good question. And thank you for asking. That's a very good question. So I was in the department store business, and at that time period, major regional malls were opening up all over America. That was actually a new thing, led by developers like Mel Simon, like the Taubman companies, like the DeBartolo companies. And what was happening is department stores were looking for ways to expand their footprint. America was growing, people had discretionary income. But something more insidious was happening inside the malls, and I tried to run a red flag up on the issue that I saw multiple times inside of Macy's, and it never worked. It was falling on deaf ears. Essentially, it was this. When a developer opens a major regional mall and puts in four very big department store anchors, they have to fill anywhere from 500,000 to 800,000 square feet with smaller space retailers. So what happened, this whole Malling of America, as it was called, created an enormous opportunity for specialty stores to emerge. And what I was seeing when I was walking through the malls, I was having just outstanding results in my various positions in the department stores, but I got a knot in my stomach every time I walked through a mall because, as well as I would think I was doing in mall after mall from one end of America to the other, I was seeing stores with names like The Limited, like Lane Bryant, like Victoria's Secret, like Zales Jewelries. I could go on and on and on. Incredible number of shoe stores. And what I realized was department stores had an interloper for the first time ever because customers, in fact, did go to major regional malls, but they were walking around the malls and you could read in, all the standard business rags, the explosive growth of specialty retailers across America. And it occurred to me they were taking our lunch in department stores. Department stores had shot themselves in the foot to start with by keeping local nameplates on local. For instance, I'm in Dallas, Texas. There was a division called Sanger Harris in Dallas. There was a division called Foley's in Houston. There was a division called Riches in Atlanta, and on and on and on. And so we had to suffer through literally down to different labeling on the insides of clothes, different advertising plans, different ways you hire, all of those things, and incredible redundancy in staff. So I developed a point of view, which I in fact put up in bold print in presentations to the chairman of Macy's at that time, which said in any category of retail merchandise that reaches measurable size, and I used $1 billion as measurable size in 1982, specialty stores will emerge to become an important, if not dominant, channel of distribution for that product. And then I would make the case by using the names. When you start talking about jewelry and its margins, intimate apparel and its margins, they were clearly targeting the highest margin parts of department stores. And I was not getting it was heresy to talk about going to one name. I said, we should have one name nationally. We should, that all the things you would think I might have said. And so I was highly frustrated because I saw department stores lumbering towards the swamp as the dinosaurs did. And at the same time, my business school buddy came through town. He was a senior partner at Bain out in the Silicon Valley. And he started talking about this new emerging business called video games. And he went through great detail to explain Moore's law, and semiconductor chips were rising in speed and power and graphics capabilities while their cost was dropping in half, so that video games were going to penetrate households. It went on and on and on, and a light went on in my head. And I said, well, whoa, Jim, let me talk to you about my premise that in any channel of retail, and I said, this sounds like this is very much going to be $1 billion channel of distribution for a new technology driven form of home entertainment. We should get a first mover advantage, and you should quit your job at Bain and I'll quit my job at Macy's, and we will start what would become the first video game store in the world in the middle of 1983. And that's what happened.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And to your point about the rise of specialty retail back then, I mean, yes, there was GameStop, but other category specialists as well. And I know you touched on a few of the apparel ones and and shoes, but also things like pets and toys and office and
Yeah.
DIY superstores. This was really the time for the category specialists. It was also the peak mall period. And you just touched on the emergence of personal computers. And these devices, of course, are laughable by today's standards. But at the time, the idea of having a computer in your own home was revolutionary. And as you say,
Yes.
it spawned a whole new industry, which is video games. So really interesting to see how all the pieces kind of came together for you. I guess my question to you is how did you stay on top of all this change? And Maybe with the benefit of hindsight, is there anything that you would have done differently?
Well, in this particular part of the evolution of specialty store retailing and video games, I'd say we pretty much nailed it. I can give you a very long list of ways we screwed up later, but in identifying an evolutionary change and acting on it based on what the implications would be for future channels of distribution, we clearly history has shown that was a pretty good decision. Can't complain with that. Again, we learned a lot, and ever since I worked in my family's furniture warehouse and listening to my father, the mantra was the customers are always right. And Napoleon saying, if you want to know what's going on the front lines, go look. So I wasn't just visiting our department stores all over the Southwest and go in and look at the store, shake hands, glad hand, and get my car and leave. I was walking through the mall, and you can't help walking through what ended up being hundreds and hundreds of malls in America. You can't walk through those without it hitting you in the face. And that's, that even someone as thick-headed as me could see that was coming. And the problem is you couldn't get anybody at Macy's to walk out of their anchor stores and look at what was happening. And that's kind of on them.
We're going to talk about GameStop a little bit more later on in the conversation, but if we maybe switch gears now and talk about Laura Mercier. In your book, you mentioned that in the mid 90s, something was brewing in the world of cosmetics, and you say that the oldest form of selling these products had become new again. Brands like Mac and Bobby Brown were trumping the fashion and tech oriented brands. And so you had an idea to launch a cosmetics line led by a makeup artist. Now, that is quite a pivot from video games. You shared this idea with Terry Lundgren, former CEO and chairman of Macy's, who at the time had just left Neiman Marcus. What happened next? How did the idea progress? And what did you
Sure.
learn along the way?
Again, great questions. I can tell this retail oriented. I love that. I love this. I really do. So, so when I was in the department store business, I was in charge of cosmetics as one of the areas I was in charge of. And obviously, being a very young guy, fresh out of business school, just very, very aggressive, wanting to grow my career, I realized cosmetics was not something I knew much about. So I set about studying the history of cosmetics and was struck by it was so easy to lump the evolution of cosmetics into three buckets in order. And when you go back to the dawn of retail cosmetics, the everyone who started a cosmetics company had a background as a makeup artist. They had names like Estee Lauder. She was a makeup artist. Princess Marcella Borghese was a makeup artist. The Revson brothers, incredibly, they started Revlon. They used to put, if you can imagine, and imagine in the mid 1940s when they would travel on airplanes, which was already unique enough, they wore fingernail polish. These men wore fingernail polish and would ask the women on the flights, what do you think about these colors? Now, think about that in the 1940s. So they were true, this is true old school merchandising. And then as you take that evolution forward, you realize as Estee Lauder and these other brands started getting larger, they could start using the labs that they had, the laboratories, to generate new products. And they very quickly figured out through lines like Clinique that sure enough, if you add new products to your line based on the labs where they were developed and developed scientifically to help women, and there was a giant leap forward, all based on lab results for cosmetics. And and if you go forward from there, and that lasted for about 20 years, and if you go forward from there, it became very fashion oriented, so that all the couture lines started bringing out their own cosmetics. And so if Chanel had a particular red apparel in their line, they would develop a red lipstick, and they would come out and say red is the color for the fall. here's the dresses you'll wear to a cocktail party, and here's the lipstick that. So it was a very consecutive, and there was a huge move towards fashion. All of a sudden, and Terry and I had been going to lunch probably 2, 3 times a year for years. We were two, and inside of Macy's, he and I were kind of two hypos, if you will. So we always crossed paths when they would invite us up to Cincinnati to have conversations. And I would say, "What's going on new and exciting and different?" And he would say, "Not really much, nothing really." And in 1995, all of a sudden, or even late 94, he said, "You would not believe this line out of Canada called MAC." And he started giving me numbers. And I said, "Well, what does MAC stand for?" And he said, Makeup Artist Cosmetics. And a light went on in my head at lunch. And I went, "Oh my gosh, everything old is new again. Do you think this cycle?" And started talking about makeup artists. And that's when he told me about Bobby Brown. And that's when he told me about Trish McEvoy. So I had three data points essentially that validated my notion. And I said, so I got to know a little bit, and they were all three very creative people developing these lines. And it occurred to me that if you approached it from a very academic end, and thought about how do you launch a makeup artist line, and came up with a few big ideas. One was you'd consult the fashion leaders in all the fashion magazines, and who are the hottest makeup artists. You would have a lab set aside to develop based on them. And I knew I needed a face of the company, and Terry Lundgren introduced me to a woman named Janet Gerwich, and I took her to lunch, and I was talking with her about all this evolution. She wasn't sure she wanted to leave her job. She's senior merchant at Neiman's, and I said, "Well, you don't have to. I'm going to do this whether you do it or not." And she said, "I'll do it." And next thing you know, we started the company, and the rest is history.
Were there any learnings that you could apply from GameStop to your time at Laura Mercier, or is it just such a different industry?
They're on a couple of levels, such a different industry. It was a combative, cosmetics is very combative compared to, we were the first and everyone was interested in us. So we had a very different world as merchants in a video game store versus an industry where you have to fight for shelf space. You have to fight for what is the financial agreement between the retailer and us relative to the beauty advisors on the counter, when you have to fight for lab time, when you have to fight for shipping rates, stuff like that. It was a tough and gritty business, and I have to tell you, I didn't like it at all
Really?
relative to having been on the other side of the table. I'm not that guy. I can't.
Mm.
I don't have sharp elbows. I just refuse. To me, businesses should just be an extension of your life. And if I don't live my life that way, I don't want to live my work that way. I do think that a really important lesson for people who might be listening to your podcast, I hear so much about people starting businesses because it's their passion or it's their hobby or it's something. And I think those are great. I can't believe people would want to ruin something that's a passion by making it their work, but so be it. But I have two examples there where we came at the business by having a hypothesis, we tested it, we validated the concepts, and we moved forwards with it. I hear so often of people starting companies, and there are obviously huge success stories out there of people doing that. But I can't imagine in this day and age with access to data, information, technology, and all those things, why people wouldn't do some serious homework before they decided to launch a new business,
Yeah.
especially in retail.
I know, I get that. It's funny because what you're saying has sparked a thought. I obviously love retail and I'm really passionate about it enough to, have been an industry observer and commentator for 20 years and to have launched this podcast. But I'm also really into gardening. And every now and then I think, should I quit retail and become a garden designer? And then I just think no, because I'm too passionate about it and I don't want to
Yeah,
mix, work with
yeah.
pleasure.
You've
So
got to love. Yeah, you've got to love outside of work, and it is a
yeah.
passion. It's a hobby. You're an enthusiast. You love it, and you know well enough that it doesn't matter what the business is. Starting it gets to be a drag. And there are days when you just say, oh my gosh, I cannot believe I did this to myself, and on and on. Don't ruin gardening with all of that.
I'll stick to retail. Now that is
Yeah,
really interesting. I mean, it does kind of go against what a lot of a lot of people do say. Go find your passion, and then it never feels like work. And I actually had James Keys on the podcast, the
yeah,
former CEO of
good
Blockbuster and
friend.
7-Eleven. Yeah,
He and
and
I are good friends.
yeah. He was great. I mean, he was very passionate about, education and continual learning. And we talked about the importance of embracing diversity and surrounding yourself with people that don't look and think like you. And that was, I thought, a really important point. He also talked a lot about constant evolution and adaptability. And I love this term that he's coined, that CEO shouldn't stand for Chief Executive Officer, but change equals opportunity. So, yeah, it's just funny. I mean, he did kind of call out the importance of finding your passion. So, interesting to hear contrasting views around that, but to each their own.
Yeah.
I speak to a lot of retail leaders on this podcast from both sides of the Atlantic, and something that comes up a lot is the importance of focus. This idea that you have to know what your brand stands for, know who your customers are, not try to be everything to everyone, and then executing really well. So, in your opinion, how important is clarity and, I guess, consistency when it comes to vision?
So there are two parts, I think, to that. The first part is incredibly critical at the outset. You need to know, it, all a brand is a promise. It's a promise of what you're going to get. And especially when you're starting and you're trying to make a name for yourself and establish your brand, having extreme focus, especially on those points where you touch the customer and where you present yourself, very important that you deliver on that promise, not just in your advertising and marketing, but where the customer meets the merchandise. So I agree with that. But frankly, my co-founder at GameStop, a guy named Jim McCurry, and he and I both went to grad school together, and he and I have been best friends like brothers ever since. And we had a debate a month ago that he clearly, and he's probably batting 1,000 with me. That's a low bar, but he has, in his view, I end my book with a list of leadership principles. The last one being continuous improvement. He argues very persuasively that it's not continuous improvement any longer. It might have been in the 80s, where the goal is do whatever it is you're doing better, smarter, faster, more efficiently. He believes, because of the way of the world we live in today, the right term is continuous change. And I believe, because change is more dramatic. Change requires not looking like Wayne Gretzky used to say about hockey. I don't skate to where the puck is. I skate to where the
Where it's
puck's going
going.
to be.
Yeah.
And you have to be thoughtful, very thoughtful about how your vision for your brand will evolve based on outside forces. And so focus, very important. However, certainly within a couple of years of starting, you really should start thinking about continuous change and what should we do differently that delivers a more enhanced customer experience moving forward, based on available technology, based on new psychographic data, based on whatever, new internal efficiencies. You can go on and on. So I would say, yes, of course, focus is important. But sometimes you can have your blinders so closed on what you're doing that you miss. And I can give you two great examples from GameStop that Jim and I, with the benefit of decades behind us and our egos not so much in it, we made two really bad mistakes. And it was for this lack of a mindset on continuous change. We nailed the fact that malls in America were growing explosively and we had to get to the big major regional enclosed malls. And we did it. And we did it very effectively. Before you knew it, we had over 700 stores. What we missed 10 years later retail evolution continued in the emergence of power centers outside of malls that weren't enclosed and that didn't have necessarily department stores as anchors, but maybe a Home Depot or Lowe's, maybe a major sporting goods store, maybe Toys R Us. And it became a new locus, if you will, for retail. And that retail cost per square foot was half, a fraction of the enclosed malls. And they didn't have the requirements that you had to pass through their design and graphics people who never understood video games. You could do so much so cheaply. We missed that trend, and that's unforgivable now with 2020 hindsight. So that was one thing, and the other thing, our premise at the start was that video games are very expensive. They're $49.99 in the early 80s. And we knew that the malls were where the upscale moms were, because at that time, moms were who bought the video games for their kids, typically boys back then. And today, thank goodness, it's now everybody. But we wanted to be where the economics were. We expected prices to go down, and the only way they went down is they never went up. Okay, so today video games are still $49.99, but that argued for an emergence of uh, a used business that certainly started emerging by the mid 1990s, and that we were late to that party. By 2010, the remanufactured resale trade-in business for GameStop was over half of their profits each year. So that was the great next leg of growth there. But Jim and I didn't see that one coming either. So
Yeah, and again, with the benefit of hindsight, it's easy to call these
yeah,
things out, but I
right,
think
right,
I feel like the retail industry more generally is getting better at kind of embracing mistakes and being more agile, failing fast, and kind of understanding that mistakes are an integral part of learning and innovating and moving forward and staying
right.
relevant. So it's
Yeah, no, and I
nice to
love,
speak openly about it.
well, and I love to see that evolution. And as much as they're making a lot of right moves, I hope they're noticing the things that are an issue. For instance, it's something I experienced in Austin 2 months ago. So I love that, starting back with Bonobos and I guess the glass company, eyeglass company. They emerged online, and they started migrating to retail locations, kind of cool, upbeat, trendy retail locations. But inside, you couldn't actually buy anything. They had every item they had, and then there's a kiosk, and you ordered on the kiosk. So that has emerged as a very powerful way to companies who have proven their chops online, retail chops online, to migrate out to where the people are not going in malls, but maybe going in the next retail area. So it's a little bit uh, part of their brand to do that. And I was in Austin 2 months ago, and for reasons that don't matter, all of a sudden I learned I needed a pink shirt for an event that I was unaware they had wanted everyone to wear pink to the event. So it was great. I'm in the hip, cool, trendy part of Austin, 6th Street, 5th Street, 4th Street. I'll just go get myself a pink shirt. I found 6 men's stores within 2 blocks of my hotel, and not one of them had a pink shirt I could buy right then. They had
Oh,
pink shirts. All I could do was order them. And I think that's a problem. You know, I don't think I'm the only person that maybe either forgot a dress shirt, which is a more typical thing to do. But how can I go into 6 mainstream headline men's stores and find the shirt I wanted and was ready to pay for, and have them tell me, no, that's not how we work here? You have
yeah.
to step over to this kiosk. You're going to order. So they somehow they're going to have to figure that one out.
Yeah, because I think one of the one of the USPs of physical retail stores is the immediacy of being able to go in and buy something and walk out with it. I mean, that is something that
Yeah,
online retailers are really trying to compete with, same day, 1 hour, 30-minute delivery. But at the end of the day, you would expect that from a bricks and mortar store.
yeah,
So on the
yeah.
topic of retail today, I mean, what do you make of the current retail environment? And are there any lessons from your time as a retailer that you feel are relevant today?
I would say the main thing, and this has never changed, and it has always been a problem, and for me continues to be a problem. I cannot believe that so many companies get so inwardly looking that everything about their business is about them. It's about what can we do to make it easier on us and cheaper for us to deliver our products to our customers. That's not a way to run a business. You should always be thinking about the customer interface. What, how does a customer receive our product, and what can we do better and differently to make that a more seamless, fun, experiential kind of thing? And so few retailers, so few anybody, frankly, in
Mm,
any area of retail thinks that way. And it is shocking to me that people don't understand that it's all about the customers. And they really don't. And I have this analogy that I say to people, sometimes you have to look out the window. Sometimes you have to look in the mirror. And the ratio should probably be looking out the window is the right answer one time out of 10. And 9 times out of 10, you need to be looking in the mirror, because it's a time honored thing to blame bad results on the weather, the economic environment we're in, politics, whatever. But come on, that's not, if you could spend as much time thinking about the customer as you do about making excuses for what's happening. Like COVID, now that's a look out the window.
yeah, and a
Okay,
genuine
boy, the world
excuse, I guess.
changed. A genuine excuse that should have led to, and did for so many companies. Now, what do we do to deliver our product to customers? And the ones who did it well did well, and the ones
Mhm.
who couldn't figure out how to do it didn't do well. So, I mean, it's the same thing. And I would have thought that there was a lot more pressure on retailers to spend more and more time on that customer relationship. They talk about it, but you don't see it.
Yeah, they do talk about it, and I think in some ways retail is, it's a lot more simple than we make it out to be. I think we sometimes are guilty of overcomplicating things. It's really, as Sam Walton
Yeah,
said,
oh yeah.
it's put the customer first. They're the boss and they can fire everyone. So, and if you look at the companies that have done really well, they're the ones who, again, like Amazon, they start with the customer and then they work backwards. They build that strategy around the customer.
Yep,
Everyone calls themselves customer
yep.
centric, but very few, I think, genuinely are. So, really
I
interesting to get your
couldn't agree
views.
more.
Yeah.
I got I got that firsthand. Well, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
I learned that I knew this, but I learned it firsthand at Kinko's. When I started there, Kinko's was in the ditch. Period. Full stop. It had lost 11 million in the prior 12 months to me starting. And I walked around the corporate headquarters on day one and said, "What the heck is going on here? What a great brand. Why is it in the ditch?" And all I heard from everyone was, "Too many things to even list. It's everything," which I was highly unsatisfied with. So I told them, okay, you know what? We have 1,200 stores in America in 42 regions. I am leaving corporate headquarters. I'm going to spend the next 6 to 8 weeks visiting every one of the 42 regions, having town hall meetings, because 100% of our stores were open 24 hours a day. I'm going to have town hall meetings on every shift in every region of America. And I'm going to talk to our people in the stores. And I'm just going to say, what the heck has happened and what do we do about it? And guess what? And that was grueling. That was probably the hardest stretch I've ever had because I was doing 2 in the morning town hall meetings. I was doing 8 at night town hall meetings, 2 in the afternoon. I knew exactly what was wrong because the store man, the people who were on the floor with the customers in front of them, all told me the same thing. And it didn't matter if I was in Bangor, Maine or Coronado, California. I was hearing the same thing. And we were able, by 2 months later, we were able to have established a strategy, a go forward turnaround strategy that addressed everything I heard in the field. And as it happened, not surprisingly, our people were right. And it worked. And so the turnaround was an enormous success because we listened to the front line.
Yeah, and it's so important, and I think again to bring it back to sort of retailers today, we're seeing more and more of that where in store managers are being given more autonomy. Retailers are bringing customers into their management meetings. There's no more ivory towers. We're seeing retail leaders walk the stores and really kind of breaking down those silos. So really fascinating stuff. I want to ask you another question about Kinko's, and I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the FedEx acquisition, because I think there's some very real and relevant lessons there for retailers today. So, why was Kinko such an attractive acquisition target? Can you just maybe talk us through some of the synergies there?
Yes. So when Fred Smith walked into my office unannounced and sat down with me, which was quite a shock, as you could imagine, he said, and this explains it all. He said, Gary, you don't know this, but we have 1,000 FedEx drop off locations around the United States, places where people could go to drop off their FedEx packages. What I did know was that in about 500 of our 1,200 Kinko stores, we had a manned FedEx drop-off location where it was staffed by a FedEx person there every hour the store was open for them to accept shipments for FedEx. He said, guess what? Out of our 1,000 locations, the worst performing of your 500 locations ranks number 500 of our 1,000 locations, which says every single Kinko store that has a staffed FedEx person is better than the best non-Kinko's FedEx drop location in the United States. And he said, we try to think about how we're going to compete with UPS stores who have thousands of locations when it's very clear Kinko's has the same customer as we do. And we think it would just make a lot of sense to combine our forces. And that was the conversation.
And it just shows the kind of value in physical spaces, but also the need to your earlier point to be open to, changes, and the idea that sometimes you have to, repurpose those spaces, or there's opportunities if you repurpose that space. So in your case, not just copying and printing, but also being able to drop off packages. And then again, ultimately, I guess it's about improving the customer experience, right? Ultimately, it comes back to the customer, driving footfall, driving
Yeah.
sales, and providing a better experience
We
overall.
had at 1,200 stores, and we grew to 1,800 before FedEx bought us. But we had over 1 million transactions every week in our stores, so we had enormous foot traffic, and FedEx was a beneficiary of that along with us. I mean, we were the largest buyer of cut paper in the world when I was at Kinko's, and the second largest was the U.S. federal government. That
Wow.
gives you some idea, yeah, of
Yeah.
what we were doing in that space. Just enormous.
Let's talk a little bit about the stock market frenzy around GameStop. Now, I grew up in the US, I grew up in Connecticut, so of course, very familiar with the GameStop brand. But I think a lot of our UK and international listeners will have learned about the business during the pandemic because something happened to make GameStop a global news story. I wonder if you can talk us through the meme stock craze and what you made of it at the time.
Sure. So what I'll do is I will talk about I have found, because I've been asked this, and Jim and I made a point in when the meme stock craze started, we talked on the phone and said, we will not talk about this. People can call and ask. This is not our story to tell, someone else's, but we both knew very clearly why it happened. And the best way to describe that is, I'm not going to tell you about Babbage's. I want to talk about a potential new company on the market, okay? And it's got to do with the music industry, and it's got to do with Taylor Swift. Okay, Bruce Springsteen has sold his music catalog, as has Paul Simon. All of the major artists have sold their catalogs. So Wall Street now knows exactly how to price music. Okay, your backlog, all the music that you have. Now, imagine based on the Era tour of Taylor Swift, she looks around and says, wow, I own all of this. I have a chance to maybe take my company public. Okay. And people know how to value everything. And so they value her company, and it's a big deal. And all the Swifties buy a big stock. And, it's a very cool thing. And she has an incredibly high market share in that space, and a lot of Wall Street following. Now, imagine a Wall Street analyst is looking at this hot stock and says, well, wait a second. I see how many albums she has. I see how many songs she's written. I see how many she sold, using the most aggressive metrics for any catalog ever sold. She is still way overpriced. Way overpriced. Okay, because for whatever reason, and I think it's a short opportunity, because there's no standard you could find the value that she has, and that bubble's going to burst. And they go into a Monday morning meeting in their hedge fund, and they make the case, and their hedge fund thinks about it and says, he's right. This is what we don't know where it should be, but it should be a lot lower price. So they go and start buying a position. They start shorting Taylor Swift stock. All of a sudden, word comes out that there are people who are trying to crush her stock. No,
And
and the vast majority of people, and they defend the brand. And people who don't understand a word of what was said get it when someone is attacking Taylor. And Swifties all over the world show up and buy the stock and crush them. Okay, crush the shorts. I call this EQ versus IQ. Okay, you got an IQ suggests one thing, but the thing about IQ people is they ain't got much EQ. And if they had EQ, they'd understand passionate fans. Push it aside. There was only one company, I will argue, until Taylor Swift, that had tens of millions, legions of fans whose relationship with GameStop had bridged since they were young teenagers, standing in line on a cold night at midnight with their mother or father with them, so they could be the first of all their friends to buy a game at midnight, through their 20s, 30s, and now they're in their 40s, and they're still avid gamers. And GameStop is part of the fabric of their lives. They mark time in their lives by what titles had come out or when they were in their GameStop. And you can't, that's EQ. And when they heard that a hedge fund was trying to kill their company, and because they had Reddit as their communication depot, they got together and globally drove that stock price, and they were the first meme stock. Others have been variations, but not big. And no one understood, why did these people do that? Well, you got to have a high IQ and a low EQ to not understand when people have had a 30-year, and the last year was the 40th year of GameStop, to have that long of a relationship with the brand. And you're asking for hand-to-hand combat if you want to come out of Wall Street and try and kill a brand. And that's what was happening. No one seemed to understand it. And Jim and I were just sitting back laughing. We were there at store one when we had a customer, Big Dave from Garland, Texas, and he'd come in his coveralls. He was determined to buy every new game that came out in the history of video games. And he loved the company. There wasn't the internet then to talk about it, but he talked about it to anyone who'd listen. And we knew Big Dave, and he would call us. We had a personal relationship with him. And and we got it.
Yeah. It's been so fascinating to follow. I mean, it's still making headlines now, and of course, it's led to
Sure.
congressional hearings about market manipulation, and it inspired the
Yep.
movie Dumb Money with Seth Rogen.
Yep.
And
Yep.
GameStop was the most famous. GameStop was the most famous meme stock, but it's also happened with other businesses like AMC, which owns the Odeon cinema chain, and BlackBerry. So, yeah, just really interesting as an observer to watch it all unfold.
Your questions were awesome. You covered the waterfront. You managed, because I am all over the waterfront, and I know that about myself, but you managed to keep me reasonably corralled, which is good on you for that.
Oh,
And
thank you.
I think this has been fun.
Thank you for listening to Retail Disrupted. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the podcast, please leave a rating or review or share it with others. It really makes a difference.